Hello, random weirdos online, and all you beautiful scrufftards. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And we're gonna take a look at the front line from Kursk all the way down to Zaporizhia. And we're gonna start off with Kursk and Belgorod, where Russia made crucial moves. Actually, it's gonna force Ukraine back in a couple of days within Kursk, is my guess. After that, we're going to take a look at where Ukraine has operational initiative at Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and Dvorichna. We're going to take a look at some city fighting in Toretsk. And of course, where Ukraine is trying to surround a bunch of Russians at Pokrovsk. Then we're going to take a look at Zaporizhia, where Russia is advancing. And towards the end, I will show you how 2024 was a complete disaster for Russia. And the maps are clearly showing it beyond any doubt. So let's get into it. Kursk and Belgorod, and then moving on. Right, so here we have Mayakovsk 73's map, Kursk incursion, Belgorod incursion, and we are gonna take a look at Kursk here because Russia made a very important push. They made a push along this valley all the way down to the gas station thing here and the border crossing automobile checkpoint right on the border. And there is the flag, the Russians, so they are in control of this area. Geolocate confirmed. And that makes it problematic for Ukraine to support the troops in Oleshnia and Gogolevka. And now they basically are left with moving supplies, reinforcements along these valleys. And that might be troublesome since you no longer have any good roads to follow. You have dirt tracks like this. So I expect Ukraine to be falling back from this valley in the next couple of days. We've seen Russians trying to push across here. We have more Ukrainian drone strikes. So they've been pushing here for a couple of days, trying to enter this valley here, which will allow them to push in this way. So a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians here. What is this missile? So apparently a Ukrainian missile strike at something here. This is where Ukraine was moving in logistics, one of the entry points into Russia. For logistics, they would use this dirt road here, link up with the paved roads here within Russia and move up to Sucha. And as you can see, when Russia, this is the valley Russia pushed into a month or two ago, that effectively cut that logistical route. Russia is now trying to push in here, and they're trying to reach the valleys up here. So this part of Kursk will probably be abandoned during the weekend, or definitely sometime next week would be my guess. Or maybe the Ukrainians feel that they can support Oleshnia and Gogolevka with enough supplies to hold. I don't know. Doubtful, to be honest. But it is what it is. What they can do is hold on to Goevo, because here it's much more secure to bring in supplies into this area. Goevo could be problematic for Russia. It has a big river here, the Pesel River. As you can see, protecting it, that means Russia is left with attacking from the north. They are now in control of some high ground, though, north of Goevo, which should help them out, but they still need to come in from the north, try and push into the west to cut some supplies, and so Goevo could become problematic if Ukraine decides to hold this town. This area here is high ground. This is a big hill. The forested areas are on the slopes. You can see here how the forests follows creeks from the high ground into the valley here. Same thing over here. So should be a reasonably good, well-defended position with the town, with the high ground, and you have more high ground here in forested areas. We'll see. Ukraine can hold on here. This part will probably fall back. We can see here how Russia is pushing further into Ukraine, into Sumy Oblast along the border. Now is the time when we find out how sincere Ukraine is with the push into Belgorod. Do they want to shift focus from Kursk to Belgorod? Then they will hold on to territory here and keep pushing in. Will they abandon Belgorod to focus on defending Sumy Oblast as the Russians are pushing? Or will they simply hold in order to force Russia to allocate resources down here instead of fighting up here? We'll see what the Ukrainians want to do with Belgorod over the weekend, I think. But yeah, important to remember, and I keep repeating this, this is nothing strange. Ukraine knew this was going to happen. As soon as they pushed into Russia and Kursk, they realized that eventually Russia would send enough troops to push them out over time. That means eventually you would end up in this situation. So Ukraine, when they planned for pushing into Kursk, realized that at the end of that operation, they would have a lot of very angry Russians in Kursk ready to push into Sumy. So what we're seeing now is essentially part of the plan. So what I'm thinking is, and now I'm speculating, what I was talking about was stone cold facts. Ukraine knew this was going to happen eventually. They knew that they would be pushed back. They knew that sometime during 2025 they would have to fight in Sumy Oblast. So, with that in mind, I think we can assume that Ukraine has prepared a lot of defensive positions in these woods right next to the border, and definitely down here to defend Sumy itself, and they are ready for Russia pushing in along the entire border over here, border with Kursk to Sumy. So I'm thinking they pushed in, tried to hold territory for as long as possible, forcing Russia to move more and more manpower here, knowing that they would have to fall back. And now, as they're falling back, it's a fighting retreat, a fighting withdrawal. They want to move the Russians into various prepared kill zones all over the place here, where they have already ranged in artillery, mortars, airstrikes, and what have you. So as soon as the Russians enter certain areas all over the place here, Ukraine can hit those areas accurately with indirect fire. Or have troops ready on high ground, spread out all over the place with tanks, with anti-tank guided missiles and what have you. Drones, definitely. Right, so whenever the Russians enter a kill zone, a kill box, the Ukrainians are ready to engage because they know that Russia will be coming, and they have prepared this for 8 months. Ever since they pushed into Kursk, they more than likely started to prepare the defenses in Sumy in preparation for when Russia would follow them into Sumy Oblast. And we'll see how Belgorod plays into those plans. So this is going to be a couple of interesting days. Next week is going to be interesting to learn what the Ukrainians have planned and what they have in store here within Sumy Oblast. And that's going to be it's going to be interesting to see how Ukraine has prepared for this part of the Kursk operation. And here we have Deep State. As you can see, they haven't yet updated the push made by Russia to the border here. But if we move on, I want to highlight here. Here you have Dvorichna. Here you can see how Ukraine has had successes in and around Dvorichna. This is one of 3 operational areas within Ukraine where Ukraine has allocated manpower to have aggressive action aimed at the Russians. Dvorichna here, Ukraine is pushing back north of Kupiansk, surrounding this town of Dvorichna. The Russians are hampered a bit since you have the Oskil River, and it makes it a natural point for Ukraine to apply pressure, because Russia obviously has issues supplying their troops on the western side of the Oskil River. So it's easy for Ukraine to push in, apply pressure, and have operational success. So here Ukraine actually does have some initiative. They are forcing the Russians to fall back in and around Dvorichna. Down here we have seen some success as well. We saw them take Nadia. Andrew Perpetua has some Ukrainian gains up here as well. So slight, they have some success, but it's not as prominent as up at Dvorichna. Moving down, we can see here how Russia is expanding around Terny. Moving down to Chasiv Yar, Andrew Perpetua also has some Ukrainian gains within Chasiv Yar on the outskirts. And Toretsk definitely is another operational area where Ukraine has some initiative. They are pushing in, they're grabbing buildings, and they are actually almost encircling the Russians within Toretsk at a couple of locations. And then, of course, Pokrovsk, where Ukraine is pushing back around Lysivka, Peshane, Shevchenko, Uspenivka, Solone, Kotlina. So this is also an operational area where Ukraine is putting in a lot of effort to reclaim territory and forcing the Russians back. That said, we should not forget that Russia is expanding territory further south, and of late they have been making a lot of gains here around Zaporizhia. Andrew Perpetua is showing even more gains down here, I believe it is. So Russia is still advancing, but I think it's important to remember that all of a sudden we have Dvorichna, we have Toretsk, and we have Pokrovsk, where Ukraine is pushing back and reclaiming territory. It's not a one-sided conflict anymore. You have three significant hotspots, Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Dvorichna, where Ukraine is actually gaining momentum and reclaiming territory and securing the initiative. And we're going back to Mayakovsk 73 and Toretsk. Different mappers, they highlight different areas as contested, as under Russian control, as under Ukrainian control. Nothing strange about it. It's urban warfare. It's confusing. Who is in control of what? You really don't know, because urban warfare is a building, a multi-story building, could be held by both sides at the same time. You could be in control of different levels or different floors, different staircases, different apartments in a multi-story building, right? So it's not as clear cut as in a forest where you draw a line, they are on this side, they're on that side. In a city, you can be in control of a street, but you have control of 5 buildings on that street, but the 6th building, the enemy is in control of 3 floors and you're in control of 2. And in another building, you basically have all of it, but the enemy still holds on to a single apartment, right? And you can't push them out. It's really, really difficult fighting in an urban environment and establishing where the front line is. So the gray area here, it could be a confusing mishmash of where you have enemies and friendlies all over the place. So you could be in a building, secure a building, but you're still completely surrounded. It's confusing as hell. What is important though is, I think, this here. This is a geolocated Ukrainian assault into these buildings along the street here. And most mappers agree that Ukraine has pushed in here, in this area. This is what most mappers are agreeing on. How the situation is over here, that's where it gets, it differentiates between the various mappers. But since we now have geolocated Ukrainians in this building along this street, not this street, the street is over here, that is interesting because it obviously means that Ukraine is pushing in here towards this area where everyone agrees that Ukrainians are, right? So that means that this street here becomes super crucial. This street is the street that connects Russians here with the Russians down here. So if you, it's a bit different now in the day and age of drones, admittedly, but before 2022, before drones were added, if Ukraine can put, say, a Bradley or two Bradleys up here, firing down along this street, as you can imagine, that's all you back then would have needed to completely sever the Russians up here from the Russians down here. Right? So what you do is you, in urban warfare, you want to control lanes. So with a couple of vehicles up here, they could dominate this lane. In other words, this street all the way down here. And that would allow the Ukrainians to work their way systematically, one street at a time up here, clear out. It would take ages to clear out all of these buildings, but you get the point. And then you can move and secure the buildings up to this main street here, right? And then work your way in as long as you maintain control of this lane here, right? You don't need to take these buildings to control this area. You just need to shut down lanes of approach, right? So that is why it's so crucial that Ukraine is pushing in here, because it gives them access to fire along this street, giving them the ability to open fire on anyone trying to cross, right? And if you want to move food, water, ammunition, you're gonna have to run across, right? And that makes you an easy target for a vehicle or a machine gunner up here firing along this lane here. So yeah, I'm this here with geolocated Ukrainians in these buildings. That's a real issue for the Russians in Toretsk. And should Ukraine be able to move in and, like I said, gain access to the lane here, they don't need a presence down here. They just need to be able to fire along this main street with heavy weapons. And then the Russians up here, they are in trouble if Ukraine can establish fire control, as it were. That's a wonderful word everyone uses nowadays. If they have fire control along this street. And we're staying with Mayakovsk 73, moving down to Pokrovsk, because, like I've pointed out in multiple videos by now, Ukraine is trying to isolate the Russians in this pocket. You can see them pushing into Shevchenko, pushing into Solona, pushing into Spinivka. We have a clear move by Ukraine to cut off the Russians up around Vovkova and Kotlyna. And what they're doing is moving into Solona. They cut this bridge that Russia is relying on to get across the Solona River down here at Nova Vasilivka. So Ukraine is pushed in here into Solona. Russia can no longer use that bridge. They've pushed into Pashana. That means it's risky for Russia to come up this way, moving through Pashana to reach Vovkova. And they're coming into Shevchenko, and from Shevchenko they can move down here, follow the cover here along a smaller river creek to reach Novotroitske, or pushing in towards the dam here, because at the dam this is the last reliable crossing point for the Russians to supply troops in Vovkova, Solona and up at Kotlyna. So Ukraine is pushing in, cutting off logistics for the Russians, threatening to basically cut off and potentially surround the Russians up here And I mean, the Russians have hundreds, maybe a couple of thousands of troops here fighting at Udachne, Kotlyne, Vovkove, and Peshane. So if Ukraine can pull this off, gain some momentum next week, this could be a huge win for Ukraine here at Pokrovsk. Here we have Andrew Perpetua's map. Up here you have the great city of Zaporizhia front line. This is the 10th of March. And as you can see, a lot of Russian activity here. A lot of Russian shelling, Ukraine countering with some drones. But we're going to march through March to see what's happening down here in south of Zaporizhia. Boom, some Russian gains, right? Russian places flag. We move on. As you can see, a lot of activity from the Russians striking targets all along the front line. And now we're on the 17th. More gains here, right? Keep going, keep going. You can see the Russians are, they're not letting down on Zaporizhia. In March, we have a lot of focus on Pokrovsk and Belgorod, but take a look. The Russians are focused on Zaporizhia, and some small gains here as well on the 25th. So yeah, I mean, as you can see here, they are pushing and they are shelling here at the moment, the other day. So they are making a big effort trying to push north here at Kamyanske. But if we zoom in, we can see there's a lot of creeks and valleys in the way. So an open territory with all of these farmland or farm fields. Stepove, another. Remember at Avdiivka, north of Avdiivka, there was a small village called Stepove that the Russians never managed to take. They fought for 4 or 5 months at this tiny village called Stepove. It was where the Bradleys fucked up the T-90. That was at Stepove. Here we have another Stepove, small village. We'll see if the Russians struggle as they did at the other Stepove at Avdiivka. That's going to be interesting. Where was I? Yeah, but so, and they are getting closer to the Ukrainian defensive line. Remember how Russia had the prepared defensive line here along Robotyne, Verbove. Somewhere up here is where the Ukrainians have their defensive line. So Russia is currently pushing through the no man's land, you can call it, between the Russian trenches and the Ukrainian main trenches. So we'll see what happens when Russia actually reaches those proper Ukrainian defensive lines. Right now they're pushing through windbreaks that are filled with trench lines and minefields as well, but this is not where you have the big fortifications. That's further north. So we'll see how this goes, but clearly Russia is intent on pushing up this way towards Zaporizhia. So I figured, here we are, a couple of months into 2025. I just want to highlight how the war has progressed throughout 2024. Here you have 1st of January 2024. You can see the front line here in Ukraine. Ukraine itself, Romania, Poland, Berlin, and Germany, Austria, Milan, down in Italy and Switzerland. So let's see how it progresses. This is January. Let's move on to February 1st. Did anything happen? I don't know. Let's head to March. Oh, something's happening. Yeah, it moved. Let's see here. Let's head on to July. Let's head on to the 1st of July. Oh, boom. Did you see how much the front line moved? Right? Did you see how much the front line moved? We're in July. Let's head on over to September of 2024, the 1st of September. Oh, now we're moving into Pokrovsk, right? We're moving towards Pokrovsk here in September. All of a sudden, we're seeing stuff happening up in Kursk as well. I mean, You see where I'm getting at? This here, compared to Poland, Slovakia, Austria, Germany, this is what's happening over the course of multiple months in 2024. December, 1st of December 2024. Oh, now we're talking, right? About, I mean, Poland, right? Now, what I'm trying to show you here is that all the talk of a collapsing Ukrainian front line is bullshit. This here is not a collapsing Ukrainian front line. They're falling back, absolutely. We can see it on the map that Russia is slowly pushing Ukraine back. But it's so slow that it's at a snail's pace. In 2024, between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk, Russia barely managed to occupy an area the size of Luxembourg. Right here, it took them a year to barely occupy an area the size of Luxembourg. How many thousands of troops died achieving this for the Russians? How many hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were lost? To spend a year trying and not even occupying an area the size of Luxembourg. The Ukrainian front lines have not collapsed. It's a fighting withdrawal done in an orderly fashion. And how do we know it's an orderly fashion? Because Russia has not pushed through and reached the Dnieper River in a year. It is not taking. They did not break through and push to Zaporizhia or Dnipro and force the Russian Ukrainians to fall back en masse. That is how we know that the Ukrainians are fighting a controlled fighting withdrawal. They are in control of their forces as they are slowly falling back. And the Russians are being ground to dust and minced meat, trying to push through, and they are failing. Right? It's clear. It's so clear when you zoom out and take a look at the maps and compare it to the bordering countries, right? Basically, nothing happened in the entirety of 2024. Compared to what Ukraine did in a few short months in 2022. All of the green here, Ukraine liberated in 2022. This is what collapsing front lines look like, right? The green, that is when Russia fled, ran for their lives from the Ukrainian counterattacks. What's happening here along the front line in 2024 is not what Ukraine did to Russians in 2022. Right? Now, granted, Ukraine did not manage to push through down here in 2023 either. Right, so Russia is clearly having more success than Ukraine in 2023. But still, it's not a collapsing front line. And any so-called expert or YouTuber or whatever that's claiming that Ukraine is collapsing, that they are fleeing, that they have no control of the situation, they're lying. Flat out lying. Or they're dumb as shit. And don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Right? Now, containing the Russians obviously comes at a cost. It's not like Ukraine is losing one guy and killing 20 Russians. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that Ukraine is currently in control, even if they are being pushed back because they're outgunned, outnumbered, and so on. But they are falling back in a controlled manner, and Russia is paying a heavy, heavy price for every inch that they managed to grab here along the front line in Ukraine. That's gonna have to be it. That's it for this time around. Hope you found it interesting. We'll see what happens up in Kursk over the weekend next week. I'm thinking Ukraine will now begin to fall back into Sumy Oblast and my guess is that they have a few surprises waiting for the Russians um, as part of the plan ever since they pushed into Kursk. And also, gonna need to keep an eye on the street fighting in Toretsk. If Ukraine can lock down a couple of those streets, that would go a long way in denying the Russians the ability to supply frontline units further into the city. And Solona, outside of Pokrovsk, seems to be a really important village at the moment if Ukraine can secure it, thereby forcing Russia to abandon that bridge south of Solona. And yeah, well, then, of course, 2024. What a disaster for Russia that year was. So the hope is that since 2024 was such a disaster, and that Ukraine has moved so many Russian assets into Kursk and Belgorod, 2025, we are seeing it at Zaporizhia, Toretsk, and Pokrovsk. Ukraine can begin to have operational momentum at certain locations and begin to turn the war around ever so slightly. Anyway, that's going to have to be it. I hope you found it interesting. As always, go på marsch, Ukraine, and give them hell.